Okay, so I'm going to be talking about anarchism and authority. And so I'll just kind of jump into it because I've got a lot to cover. Okay, so historical anarchists, they often claim that they advocate the abolition of authority. A typical formulation is, for example, the 1936 Zaragoza Congress resolutions of the CNT. They claim that once the revolution has moved beyond its violent phase, the following will be abolished. And this list is very typical. It's private property, the state, the principle of authority, and as a result of this, the classes which divide humanity into exploiters and exploited, oppressors and oppressed will also be abolished. So there's kind of three kinds of things that need to be abolished in order for class society to be abolished, and they're kind of three aspects of a whole. But despite how often the word appears, especially as part of this triad, it can be really difficult to actually figure out what it even means. And this is because, as is frustratingly often the case, historical anarchists don't really define their terminology. And so you have to figure it out through context and piecing together a huge number of fragments together into an overarching picture. So I'm going to go through what anarchists mean by authority and then go into some of their views about the emergence of authority, and then talk about how anarchists think about this stuff can be useful for modern kind of thinkers, as opposed to just being a historical curiosity. So the few definitions of authority that anarchists provide tend to be brief. So Alexander Berkman says that the right to compel you is called authority, and all government, all law, and authority finally rest on violence and force, on punishment or the fear of punishment. Lycée Reclus similarly defines authority as the right to command. Now, this definition actually follows common usage at the time. So the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which begins publication in the 1880s, defines authority as the power or right to enforce obedience, moral or legal supremacy, a right to command or give an ultimate decision. So right to command, it's common usage. Turns out that's why they don't define it, because they're actually following the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, where things get complicated is that what exactly authority means to anarchists can best be understood by connecting these definitions with their views on freedom. So it's a very complicated topic, but one of the main ways that they think about freedom is that you can be made unfree if you are dominated. A person is dominated if they are subordinate to someone who wields the arbitrary power to impose their will on them. If a person is subject to the arbitrary power of another, then even if it is not currently being exercised, then they are being dominated. So, for example, a king might have the power to order you about as his subject, but he doesn't actually exercise this. If you define freedom as non-interference, the king isn't making you unfree. He's not interfering you. But what the domination view holds is that, well, we are unfree because the king has the arbitrary power to impose his will on us whenever he wants. And so we don't actually have to be interfered with to be made unfree, although being interfered with is also itself a form of domination. Now, this definition of domination, it's not invented by anarchists. It was codified by ancient Roman authors who also are kind of repeating certain distinctions in ancient Greek thought, but anyway, leaving that aside. They have this distinction in order to explain the difference between freedom and servitude or slavery. So if you're dominated, then you're subject to the arbitrary power of a master. They have dominion over you. You're within their power. They can interfere at will. And that's how you explain the difference between a slave and a free man. Now, from the 17th century onwards, this conception was popularized by classically educated opponents of absolute monarchy, especially in the UK, but not just the UK. And over time, this definition becomes increasingly central to Republican political theory. So initially, it's what's called a neo-Roman conception of freedom. And not all of them are, in fact, Republicans. But over time, it becomes the main view of freedom advocated by Republicans and becomes absolutely connected with that social movement. Now, during the 19th century, these ideas about freedom, which were, say, applied to kings or the British Empire's rule over the United States, well, that was then applied by abolitionists to critique chattel slavery in America. Socialists apply this analysis then to capitalism and argue that legally free wage laborers are also dominated by capitalists. And it's not a coincidence that a huge number of socialists develop out of both the Republican movement and, especially in America, the abolitionist movement. Over time, socialists, especially anarchist ones, they develop an analysis of numerous forms of domination that operate at every level of society. So the state, the workplace, school, marriage, the family. They apply it to everything in a way that's fundamentally different to how it was applied, say, in the 17th century. Now, for anarchists, authority and domination are interrelated concepts, because if authority is the power/right to command/compel, then it follows that those who wield authority have the power to subject others to their arbitrary will, and in so doing dominate them. So Malatesta, for example, says that an established authority has the capacity of imposing its own wishes and its own interests upon the mass of its subjects. Notice the language here. It's not that they're actually imposing their wishes all the time, but the point is that they have a certain power to do so. And that's clearly him talking about domination. Other authors are more explicit. So Charlotte Wilson, for example, is very clear when she says that over and over again, in fact, that authority is one of the main forms of domination in contemporary society. Another kind of connection here is that in Republican political theory, a person who's dominated was called a master, and those who were subject to this domination were called slaves. And this is true even if no one actually really owned them. So, as citizens are the slave of the monarch. Now, this is why anarchists often refer to those who wield authority as masters and label different systems of domination as kinds of slavery. In so doing, they're not saying that, being a wage laborer working for a capitalist or a housewife oppressed by your patriarchal husband is exactly the same as being a chattel slave in the American South. They're not saying that. They were never saying that. What they're doing is they're taking existing political language that dates back to antiquity and was widely known at the time, and they're extending it to other spheres. And so in this context, the famous anarchist slogan, "No gods, no masters," it's a crystallization of their opposition to domination and authority. As it were, consistently applying this opposition to domination, saying we should abolish it all and we should root it all out, rather than just focusing on specific forms. So authority clearly involves domination, but this is where things get complicated. Not all kinds of domination are authority. For anarchists, authority is the institutionalized power to dominate. This institutionalization can occur through a formal organization or a more diffuse social structure. So it doesn't actually have to be literally institutionalized in a formal organization. It's just that's the best word I could really come up with to encapsulate how they use the term. Wilson specifically refers to authority as a form of human association. So it's a kind of social structure in which certain people have or claim the power to rule over others. So it's distinct from any random act of domination that may occur in a society. Berkman illustrates this point quite clearly. He talks about a thief and a police officer. Both can violently coerce someone to do something, but only the police officer wields the authority to do so. The police officer, unlike the thief, is granted the right to compel command by an institution, namely the state, such that they have certain powers which other people do not. So authority is therefore a power that is socially generated by a hierarchical structure in which certain people have the right to compel/command and those beneath them must obey. The kind of social structure that generates authority is explained by Reclus at length. He wrote the following. It's a long one, but it's good. He says, "We find everywhere, in all social relations, positions of superiority and subordination. The sacrosanct system of domination encompasses a long succession of superimposed classes, in which the highest have the right to command and the lowest have the duty to obey. The official morality consists in bowing humbly to one's superiors and in proudly holding up one's head before one's subordinates. Each person must have, like Janus, two faces with two smiles, one flattering, I can't say that word, I'm too dyslexic, but solicitous, and even servile, and the other haughty and nobly condescending. The principle of authority, which is the proper name for this phenomenon, demands that the superior should never give the impression of being wrong, and that every verbal exchange he should have the last word. But above all, his orders must be carried out. That simplifies everything. There is no more need for quibbling, explanations, hesitations, discussions, or misgivings. Things move along all by themselves, for better or worse. And if a master isn't around to command in person, one has ready-made formulas, orders, decrees, or laws, handed down from absolute masters and legislators at various levels. These formulas substitute for direct orders, and one can follow them without having to consider whether they are in accord with the inner voice of one's conscience. Now, this analysis led anarchists to argue that authoritarian organizations are structured in a particular way. They are, with a few logically possible exceptions, hierarchical pyramids in which decision-making power is monopolized by a small group of people at the top. This ruling minority then issue orders and commands to those beneath them, such that decisions flow from the top to the bottom, or the center to the circumference. The majority of people in the organization lack real decision-making power and must, irrespective of what they think or want, do what their superiors command. So Bakunin refers to organizations that are structured from the top downwards and from the center outwards, as is the way of all authority. Elsewhere, he rejects the old system of organizing society by means of authority from the top down. Anarchists sometimes use the word authority as just a synonym for the state or the exercise of state power. So Wilson, for example, rejected authority, the government of man by man, which is that's a Saint-Simon reference. But anyway, what exactly the government of man by man meant was explained at length by Malatesta. He wrote that, for us, the government is the aggregate of the governors, and the governors, kings, presidents, ministers, members of parliament, and whatnot, are those who have the power to make laws, to regulate the relations between men, and to force obedience to these laws. In short, the governors are those who have the power, in a greater or lesser degree, to make use of the collective force of society, that is, of the physical, intellectual, and economic force of all, to oblige each to do the said governor's wish. And this power constitutes, in our opinion, the very principle of government, the principle of authority. Authority, in the sense of the state or government, is interconnected with forms of economic exploitation and domination. So the group of Russian anarchists abroad, to give one example, declare that authority always goes hand in glove with exploitation and enslavement of the masses of the people. It arises out of that exploitation or is created in the latter's interests. Authority without violence and without exploitation loses all raison d'etre. Anarchists who used authority as a synonym for the state, they are, of course, aware that there are all kinds of social structures that involve the institutionalized power/right to dominate. They just refer to those as forms of oppression rather than forms of authority. Crucially, other anarchists extended the language of authority from the state/government to the whole of society. So Reclus says that the authority that prevails in government corresponds to that which holds sway in families, though ordinarily in lesser proportions, for the government is incapable of pressuring widely dispersed individuals in the way that one spouse can pressure the others who live under the same roof. Kropotkin shared this perspective. He refers to the authority of the father in the family. Later, he argued that the modern nation state was formed by the landlord, the military, the judge, the priest, and later on the capitalist, in order to assure each of them authority over the people and the exploitation of their poverty. An extensive list of forms of authority was provided by Berkman, who wrote that at home, in school, in the office, factory, field, or shop, it is always someone's authority which keeps you obedient and compels you to do his will. Authority controls our lives from the cradle to the grave. Authority parental, priestly, and divine political, economic, social, and moral. The exact same point was previously made by his comrade Emma Goldman. Given the above, what authority a person wields or is subject to is determined by their location within an interconnected network of social structures and sources of social power. An upper-class woman may be subordinate to the patriarchal commands of her father or husband, but also wield economic authority over servants. She may derive this economic authority from class divisions that are maintained by the political authority of the state, but at the same time be oppressed by patriarchal laws that this same state enforces. So if that's what authority, well, what is authority or not? So the idea of authority is often confused with three separate notions: expertise, organization, and violence. It's sometimes said that an expert is an authority on their subject and so should be listened to. Anarchists were, of course, not against authority in this narrow sense of the term. So to quote the very famous Bakunin passage, "Does it follow that I reject all authority? Far from me such a thought. In the matter of boots, I refer to the authority of the bootmaker. Concerning houses, canals, or railroads, I consult that of the architect or engineer. For such or such special knowledge, I apply to such or such a savant, but I allow neither the bootmaker, nor the architect, nor the savant to impose his authority upon me. I listen to them freely and with all the respect merited by their intelligence, their character, their knowledge, reserving always my incontestable right of criticism and censure." Later anarchists like Manifesto make this exact same point, but they're really careful to call it expertise rather than authority. Turning to organization, people who live in authoritarian societies are often unable to imagine that another world is possible. They incorrectly assume that large-scale organization, which involves complex patterns of coordination and collective action, requires authority. It's thought that free association might work among friends or in a small group, but it cannot scale up to thousands, let alone millions. It might not be ideal, but society can only function if there are a small group of rulers who order everyone else about. Anarchists responded to this argument by pointing out that there's a distinction between delegation of tasks, which is a requirement of large-scale organization, and delegation of the power to command, which is not. So Malatesta says, in every collective undertaking on a large scale, there is need for division of labor, for technical direction, administration, etc. But the authoritarians are merely playing with words when they deduce a reason for the existence of government from the very real necessity for organization of labor. The government is the aggregate of the individuals who have had given them or have taken the right or the means to make laws and force the people to obey them. The administrators, engineers, etc., on the other hand, are men who receive or assume the charge of doing a certain work and who do it. Government signifies delegation of power, that is, abdication of the initiative and sovereignty of everyone into the hands of the few. Administration signifies delegation of work, that is, a charge given and accepted, the free exchange of services founded on free agreement. The functions of government are in short not to be confounded with administrative functions, as they are essentially different. Lastly, the anarchist rejection of authority is sometimes confused with the rejection of violence in all circumstances. So, although authority generally rests on the exercise or threat of violence, this does not mean that violence is inherently authoritarian. Anarchists advocate violence when it was, I need a drink. Okay. Anarchists advocated violence when it was necessary to establish or protect the equal freedom of all, so self-defense, overthrowing the ruling classes, stuff like that. Such violence isn't authoritarian. A woman who uses violence against her abusive husband is, in a literal sense, imposing her will onto her abuser and thereby preventing him from exercising his will. In order for her will to not be abused to be realized, his will to abuse must be restricted. But it doesn't follow from this literal state of affairs that the abused wife wields authority over her husband. She lacks the relevant kind of socially generated power/right to compel/command. She is instead resisting a form of domination and authority that is imposed on her within a patriarchal society. To treat the violence of the oppressed and the oppressor as equivalent is to abstract away from the interconnected hierarchical social structures which determine who wields authority and who is subject to it. Acts are rendered instances of authority by the particular social system in which they are embedded, rather than by the nature of the acts alone. So this is why anarchists like Rocker can, on the one hand, say they're against authority, and on the other, consistently write things like, during a revolution, the workers will have to impose their will on the present owners of the soil, of the subsoil, and of the means of production. This does not, now, importantly, this doesn't mean that any act of violence which is not grounded in authority is by definition good. So a person may lack the authority to punch their neighbor in the face, but this doesn't mean it's an anti-authoritarian act or one which is consistent with the principles of anarchism. So to quote Manifesto, if we, in one way or another, dominate others and prevent them from doing what they want, we would practically cease being anarchists. Freedom then, freedom for all and in everything, with no limit other than the equal freedom of others, which does not mean, and even having to say this is ridiculous, that we embrace and wish to respect the freedom, that's in quotation marks, to exploit, oppress, command, which is oppression and not freedom. So that's what anarchists think about authority. Now I'm going to go over how they think it arises. So the analysis of different forms of authority underpins anarchist theories of how political authority or government states arise. They generally claim that political authority develops out of three earlier forms of authority, and these are the military authority of war chiefs in combat, the divine authority of religious leaders, and the patriarchal authority of men over women and children in their household. So Wilson says that the idea of government sprang in barbarous times from the authority of the leader in war and the patriarchal rule of the head of the family. It grew up in the superstition, born of the fears of an ignorant age. Government was viewed as a divinely appointed arbiter. Reclus suggests that humans invented gods, these phantoms of the imagination, invested with supreme power, also became in the eyes of men the principle of all justice and authority. These masters of the heavens needed interpreters on earth, magicians, counselors, and war chiefs, before whom one learned to prostrate oneself as if before emissaries from on high. As we'll see, magicians and magic users are actually surprisingly central to anarchist theories of state formation in the 19th century, but I'll be covering that soon. So Malatesta in comparison, on one occasion, he views patriarchy as the earliest form of authority. So he writes that authority began with man's brutal oppression of woman, child, and weaker fellow man, and culminated in the establishment of governments, whereby through regulation, social privileges, and social injustices, first and foremost property rights, are enshrined and championed. The most detailed account of the emergence of centralized political authority is written by Kropotkin. So he thinks that in early human societies, people lived as hunter-gatherers who grouped themselves into tribes. These tribes had complex social norms, customs, systems of morality that determined social life, how conflicts within the tribe or between rival tribes were carried out and resolved. And this includes quarrels, blood feuds, and crucially, wars. So he doesn't think hunter-gatherers are kind of like noble savages. He thinks that they have complex human societies, they fight wars, they have social structures to deal with this. Now, although these societies contain some forms of domination, so especially at the level of relations between tribes, he thinks they lack any system of centralized political authority. So he writes that a whole series of institutions and a complete code of tribal morality was already developed during this primitive phase. And to keep this nucleus of sociable customs alive, habit, custom, and tradition were enough. There was no authority to impose it. The state was no more part of these tribes than it is in a society of bees or ants, or amongst our contemporaries, the Patagonians and Eskimos, and that's the term he uses. Now, Kropotkin doesn't think it's a coincidence that this kind of just happened, that hunter-gatherers just happened to not have authority. He instead thinks that it's a product of humans deliberately constructing social structures that prevent temporary leaders from transforming their power into permanent political authority. He writes that since the remotest time of the Stone Age, men have realized the disadvantages that arose when they let some of them acquire personal authority, even if they were the most intelligent, the bravest, or the wisest. Also, our ancestors worked from the earliest times to develop institutions that allowed them to fight against the establishment of such an authority. The main way this was done, according to Kropotkin, was through an elaborate system of social sanctions. So public mockery, ostracism, being kicked out of the community, and even in some cases, essentially everyone in the community getting together and deciding that they're going to kill you. Now, similar ideas have been proposed by modern anthropologists. It's called reverse dominance hierarchies. People like Pierre Clastres, Christopher Bohm. And actually, one of the earliest people to really talk about this in detail that I'm aware of is Kropotkin, but for some reason he tends not to be really credited with it. It's kind of a key insight he had that I think has been substantiated and qualified and made better by modern anthropologists with, to be frank, a lot better evidence than he was working with in the 19th century. So how then did centralized political authority arise? Well, Kropotkin's answer was that it emerged in agricultural and pastoralist societies due to dominant minorities fusing three forms of social power that had previously been independent from one another into a single institution in order to establish their rulership over the masses. So these are as follows. One, the religious power of priests, shamans, or sorcerers who had perceived knowledge of the supernatural and natural processes like weather. Two, the ideological power of custom bearers who had knowledge of culturally important traditions like proverbs, songs, past community decisions, how to settle disputes, and so forth. And three, the military power of war chiefs. Obviously, warriors derived their power from their ability to organize and commit violence. Priests, magic users, and custom bearers in comparison derived their power from exclusive knowledge that was closely guarded and only transmitted to a select few. Although these forms of social power existed in hunter-gatherer societies, those who exercised them were, according to Kropotkin, this is a quote, temporary leaders. So they could influence people, they could dominate in specific and limited contexts, say the war chiefs in war, but they had not centralized power exclusively into their hands, they didn't rule over society as a whole, and they had not constructed a hierarchical apparatus to impose their will on everybody. So the kind of top-down social structure that Bakunin talks about, where decisions flow from the center to the circumference, that doesn't exist. Now, he thinks centralized political authority arose from a seed that made it possible to fuse and institutionalize these three separate forms of social power together into one thing. And that seed for Kropotkin was the separate patriarchal family and household. He thinks this gradually led to the individual accumulation of wealth and power and the possibility of transmitting both via inheritance. And this means that wealth and power, they're intertwined. He says that the powers of minorities grew in proportion to the growing facilities for private accumulation of wealth. And this means that temporary positions of leadership can now become family dynasties, because you can transmit things to your male heir who's going to own your property rather than it being buried with you when you die, or being burnt, or being kind of redistributed to everyone in the society. The tendencies of minorities to amass power, he thinks, was first counteracted in these societies by communal forms of self-management. So Kropotkin actually has the interesting position that agriculture did not automatically and immediately lead to the development of the state. He thinks you can have stateless agricultural societies. And he thinks this was the norm until the development of state power. So according to Kropotkin, barbarian, as he calls them, agricultural villages had popular assemblies that were attended by all adult men. And these assemblies, they make key decisions, especially about disputes and land tenure, via lengthy discussions that culminate in, and he specifies this, unanimous agreement between all involved. And so he says that these assemblies lacked any authority to impose or enforce their decisions, aside from that moral authority within the community. Although I do find it weird, as a slight tangent, that Kropotkin doesn't think about, well, if these assemblies that you describe are mostly just adult men, what about the women? Are they not being subject to an authority? But he kind of doesn't talk about that. And it's also unclear if he thinks it's like literally all of them. He talks about a few examples and says this is like representative. Anyway, the majority of people in these societies are farmers and pastoralists. He thinks they value peace and they want to just devote their lives to production in order to survive. And as a result, he thinks that during a period of turmoil, they entrust their defense of their community to a small band of warriors led by charismatic leaders. These warrior bands made war their specialty and were then able to acquire far more wealth through raiding. So cattle, iron, slaves. Iron, because it's quite complicated, but basically he thinks that there's a cycle that keeps happening of the development of states and then the collapse of states and the development of states. So he thinks after the Roman Empire in Europe, there aren't states in much of it. And then state formation occurs, hence why he's talking about iron as part of the process of state formation, even though obviously, the earliest state formation was, as far as I'm aware, during like the Bronze Age. But anyway, slight tangent, in case you were confused at the mention of iron. Although, of course, iron was a thing in the ancient world. But anyway, and he then continues that given that they can amass more wealth through war, and then crucially they can transmit it to heirs through the patriarchal family, then he thinks that, well, if destitute migrants arrive in the area, such as farmers fleeing a war or plague, then wealthy warriors could offer them the necessary resources for starting a new life in a way that other people couldn't. And in exchange, the farmer would become the indentured debt laborer of the warlord. And so, to quote Kropotkin, fell into servile obligations towards the protector of the territory. Wealth undoubtedly did accumulate in this way, and power always follows wealth. Kropotkin doesn't think this process by itself leads to centralized political authority, interestingly. He argues that another element besides wealth and military force was required to constitute the authority of the few. It was an element of law and right, a desire of the masses to maintain peace and to establish what they considered to be justice, basically dispute resolution. So gradually over time, he thinks that the knowledge of traditional social norms become the specialized focus of a few families who memorize songs and poems and then teach them to their sons exclusively. And the result was that when a dispute arose, especially between communities, these custom bearers were turned to and asked to act as an arbiter or sentence finder, since nobody else could provide a solution that both parties would accept. The stage was now set for the emergence of centralized political authority. The ideological power of custom bearers and the military power of war chiefs were combined together in one single male head of a family. Kropotkin thought that gradually the first concentration of powers, the first mutual insurance for domination, that of the judge and the military chief, is made against the village community. A single man assumes these two functions. He surrounds himself with armed men to implement judicial decisions. He fortifies himself in his small tower. He accumulates in his family the riches of the time, bread, cattle, iron, and little by little imposes his domination on the peasants in the vicinity. This emerging system of political authority was then shaped by the religious power of the sorcerer or the priest, who either lent support to the new ruler in order to share domination or seized power for himself by joining force and knowledge of customary law to his feared wizard powers, which I love as a quote, again, talking about the feared wizard powers of sorcerers. And he says that the result of these societies, that they fall under what he calls the dominion of thousands of petty rulers. And then, to cut a long story short, over time, petty rulers fight and some become the bigger one, and then you get a process of centralization, although he thinks there's a counteracting tendency, but anyway, it's very complicated. So having gone through all that, the classic anarchist narrative about the emergence of centralized political authority is obviously outdated. It relies heavily on 19th century history and anthropology. It relies, especially in Kropotkin's case, on this idea that this kind of recurring pattern to state formation that applies to every single instance, such that he can actually use a case study of post-Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire Europe to create a general model that will apply to all processes of state formation. Essentially, as far as I understand him, what he thinks. Which I think is a kind of silly way of thinking. But anyway, their theory nonetheless contains what are some key insights, I think. So there are numerous forms of power, domination, or authority. They operate in different domains. They're derived from different sources. So, political, economic, patriarchal, religious, magic even. And they can be distinct entities that interact with one another in a complex system, or they can fuse together as core elements of a single social structure or organization. And the configuration of these elements is also determined by social struggle. So, the few trying to establish their power over everyone else, and everyone else creating reverse dominance hierarchies to prevent this from happening, and the kind of the to and fro between that. So he views it as like an ongoing process. He thinks that they can emerge at a specific historical moment, they can change over time, they can exist in numerous societies or only operate in one particular one, the particular configuration. And especially what's interesting here is that it's possible for people to exercise power, but not authority. So you might have the power to influence other people at the meeting due to your knowledge of customs, or you might be the person that's always relied upon for a certain kind of task. And that specialization can over time be the kind of seed for an accumulation of power with the right kind of social conditions for that. And that forms of authority are then underpinned by and derived from these kind of lower order forms of power. And also that you can have forms of authority in certain contexts or forms of power in certain contexts without having a state. So you can have, a kind of social structure of patriarchy in which women have to do what they're told, and there's patriarchal inheritance and so forth, but in which there isn't yet actually a centralized state structure. And that's, I think, a really interesting way of thinking about the development of these things, where you don't go from a situation of essentially, childhood of mankind, we're living in harmony, and then all of a sudden we start farming, and then that inevitably leads to like the rise of all the bad things. I think this kind of view leads to a more interesting and kind of viewing people in the past more like people with complex social systems and struggles. And so I think this is a conceptual system which is very flexible, can work at both a large and small scale, can be applied across space and time without having to worry too much about anachronism, because you can specify the specific source of social power you're interested in, which can be specific to that society. Say like the religious power of Catholic priests is fundamentally different to, say, the religious power of Spartan kings, at least one of which, or depending on the source, two were priests of top of my head, Zeus. They're both religious power, but if you zoom in, there's actually differences in how this institution generates their power, how it operates, what they can do with it, and so forth. So I think that's a real strength of it. And this also means you can use it to analyze a particular society, but also you can engage in comparative history, I think, quite straightforwardly with it. Now, there are so many cases in which you could talk about how power and authority of different forms coincide, interlock with one another. But I'm just going to provide an illustration from ancient Greece, because I'm currently kind of writing a book about this very slowly. So the polis of Athens is what I'm going to be talking about. For those who don't know, a polis is a political community that is united by a common law and composed of a city, or if you're going to be pedantic, a nucleated settlement. So it's a settlement with a center that's the kind of hub point. And that it has this central settlement and its surrounding hinterland. The Greek word is chora or chora. I'm never sure how to say it, but anyway. And polis is often translated as city-state, but this is just totally anachronistic. The translation actually only really starts appearing in the 19th century onwards. Before that was always translated as city, but that's also a bad translation. So it's untranslatable, polis. Now, in the 7th century BC, the polis of Athens is ruled by oligarchy. of what are called archons. Archon just means ruler. The details of how Athens is ruled at this point is really controversial. I'm still researching it. So this is just kind of the interpretation that currently makes most sense that I've seen in a bunch of different secondary sources, but it's all very contentious because essentially people are arguing over a few surviving fragments about a really complex political system. So initially, there are three elected male archons. The source claims that initially they serve for like a long time, then over time it becomes shorter and shorter, and they give really specific dates for when that occurs, but we don't actually really know about that. But the point is they're elected for a fixed term. And they are the Epimus archon, who is the chief archon, and whose name was given to the year because they didn't have like BC, AD, like, you know, we do. They didn't think of years in that term. The year was like the year of the leader. And that's how you can, if you have a list of all the leaders, then you can count backwards and figure out how many years you are forward or backward. And they then often later did this with the Olympic Games. And so that's how classicists figure out dates, is by triangulating these kind of lists. Now, the other archon is the basileus, which originally just meant like king. But interestingly here, it's used for the person who performs religious rituals. So they like lead sacrifices to the gods. And the polymarch, who's the war leader. They're on professional armies. So it's the citizens of the polis go fight. And then when they're not at war, they're just going about doing their stuff. So it's not like he's in charge of the military. It's just when there's a war, the polymarch is the person in command. Now, at an unknown date, but before the last third of the 7th century, the number of archons grows from these original 3 to 9, when 6 thesmothotai added. And this means lawmakers. They oversee most of the legal system. Now, this is what's interesting, is the law wasn't written down until the 620s. And so prior to this, it had to be remembered and orally transmitted by the archons. The archons are chosen by and from members of an aristocracy on the basis of their birth and wealth. This aristocracy was later called the Eupatrids. Some people think this was never used at the time. I think they're wrong. But anyway, this meant those from good fathers. The Eupatrids formed the religious, political, and economic ruling class of Athens. Most were large landowners who owned their own farms, and in addition to this, received tribute from a large group of small farmers who are called the Heketemoroi, or the Pelatae, and the Heketemoroi, which literally means sixth parters or sixth part men, because they had to hand over 1/6 of their total crop to the aristocracy, the Eupatrids, who they're subordinated to. We don't really know how this happened, like if they were sharecroppers or more like serfs or whatever. We just know that they had to give this tribute. Or maybe it was rent, you know, we don't really know. The source is very vague. Now, a significant number of small farmers fall into debt bondage in Athens, or were sold abroad as slaves. And this occurred when, you know, due to a bad harvest, a famine, they're unable to pay back a loan or the tribute, or this is the only way to get food is to become a debt bond under an aristocrat. Now, this is obviously very complicated, and sorry if I'm so overwhelming if you're not familiar with ancient Greece. But I think that the anarchist lens is quite a useful way of thinking about this case study. So, you know, rather than anachronistically imposing the category of the state onto the past, which, in case you're not aware, does not exist as a concept until the 16th century. Quentin Skinner talks about this a lot in detail. Anyone who talks about the state prior to this as being anachronistic, it doesn't mean that state-like things don't exist. I'm not saying it was anarchist utopia. It's like, no, that there were other kinds of power structure that cemented ruling class power, which were historically specific, culturally specific. And I think it's a mistake to like impose this one category onto all of them. And it's essentially a product of I think, bad 19th century history. But anyway, I think we can instead analyze different forms of power authority that operate within a historically and culturally specific set of social structures. So we don't have to write as if there's these self-contained institutions, which just doesn't make sense in this context, like, you know, the economy or religion, and then they interact with one another. Instead, we can look about how political, economic, patriarchal, military, religious power relations are intertwined and mutually constitute one another. So, you know, the archons weren't just rulers who wielded political authority in the polis. They were men in a patriarchal society who were elected by and from a group of aristocratic landowners who relied on a labor force of small farmers and indentured debt laborers. Their political authority was grounded in a set of patriarchal and economic relations of authority. You know, you could command your wife, your children, your subordinates. At the same time, that political authority was intertwined with their exclusive power to implement, know, and transmit legal knowledge, because the law is not written down. It's only transmitted among them, as a select few, in a way that's quite reminiscent, I think, of Kropotkin's barbarian example. And this remains mostly the case even after laws are written down from Dracon onwards, which is where we get the word draconian from, although we don't actually really know much of anything about the laws. But anyway, most people couldn't read, so they would have these like blocks of stone with laws chiseled in, even though loads of people can't actually read it, because it signifies like the power of the ruling elite of the polis over everyone. And lastly, the polis of Athens during its oligarchic phase, it fuses these multiple forms of power authority. So, you know, you've got lawmaking, court cases, leading military operations, organizing religious celebrations, and they're all fused into this like one institution, but then they're divided up, the exercise of these powers, to specific individuals. So like this archon is does the religious sacrifices. This archon is the war chief. These archons really focus on court cases. And so they have this interesting kind of division of labor, but it's a small, it's not that large a society. So it's among, a tiny number of dudes, rather than like a massive, organization like we have today with the modern state. So kind of conclude, modern socialists, they often turn to Marxist theory when they're looking for a method and approach to studying contemporary society or the distant past. I think this can be really valuable. I just also think that we can also look at historical anarchist theory and think about how their analysis of forms of interlocking power, domination, authority systems also provide a useful lens, and it hasn't been given the attention it deserves. And so I think learning about historical anarchist theory is valuable, not just because it's intrinsically interesting to learn about the past, but also because I think it can actually provide a source of inspiration for the theory that modern socialists should write in the present. I'm not going to say that Kropotkin's theory of state formation is true. I'm going to say it's interesting, and there's some interesting conceptual machinery at play that maybe we can tinker with and use in a modified form to think about the study of the past in general, like what I'm trying to do with the ancient world, Rome and Greece, or also, of course, contemporary society. So thanks for listening. Sorry if I talked really quickly. I hope everyone could follow. I was kind of machine gunning because I had so much to cover. But yeah, thanks for listening.